In this lecture, we're going to talk about the light-dependent reactions. Sometimes they're also just called the light reactions. The process of photosynthesis can be divided up into kind of two major sections, right? So there's the light-dependent reactions, which we're going to talk about today, which include photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, which we'll go into detail in a minute. The light-independent reaction, sometimes also called the dark reaction, is composed of the Calvin cycle or something called carbon fixation. So first we'll talk about what a photosystem is. A photosystem is a cluster of chlorophyll and proteins that absorb sunlight, and they generate high energy electrons. Photosystem 2 is where our journey begins. It occurs in the thylakoid membrane. Remember, thylakoids are those structures that are inside of chloroplasts. And what happens is that photon strikes pigments. Photons are particles of light, so they can carry energy, and that energy is funneled into chlorophyll A. When the photosystem 2 is struck by the photons, two high energy electrons are released, and they go to the electron transport chain. The electrons are replaced or added to this cycle by breaking apart water with something called photolysis, or using light to break apart water, because photo means light and lyse means to break apart. In this diagram, we can go over how photosystem 2 functions. First, photosystem 2 is struck by light from the photons, so that comes from the sun, and then when that light strikes photosystem 2, it releases electrons from water. So water molecules are broken apart. They provide the electrons, and then they also break down into oxygen gas and to all of these hydrogen ions. So that's the first part of this process. Light strikes photosystem 2 and breaks apart water to release electrons, oxygen gas, and hydrogen ions. Once the water has been broken apart, the electrons that were released are sent down a series of proteins called the electron transport chain, and those electrons are going to be used later during this photosynthetic process. Next, we'll talk about photosystem 1. So there are also pigments such as chlorophyll in photosystem 1, and they use energy from light also to re-energize electrons. So the pigments in photosystem 1 are also struck by photons, and they re-energize electrons. When the electrons are re-energized, they're picked up by this molecule called NADP+, and it collects electrons plus hydrogen ions, and it becomes a new molecule called NADPH. NADPH carries the electrons to the light-independent reactions. So it's a way of transferring energy from the light-dependent reactions to the light-independent reactions. So now we can revisit our diagram. Remember, during photosystem 2, we released electrons and we released some oxygen gas and hydrogen ions. Now in photosystem 1, we're going to re-energize the electrons that traveled through this system, and they are going to continue on through a couple more proteins where they are going to be collected by this molecule NADP+ to become NADPH. The NADPH also collects a hydrogen. That's where that H comes from. And so then that NADPH molecule now acts like a charged battery. The NADP+ was the dead battery. We charged it by adding electrons and a hydrogen ion. And now that energy can be carried someplace else in the thylakoid and carry energy to do new reactions. We mentioned at the beginning during photosystem 2 that hydrogen ions are released because we break apart water. So those have been collecting or accumulating in the thylakoid inside the chloroplast because we split apart the water. So there's going to be a buildup of hydrogen ions within the thylakoid, which gives them a positive charge relative to the stroma, which has a negative charge. Remember, the stroma is the liquid outside of the thylakoids. This causes a gradient to form. Remember, a gradient is when you have different concentrations of dissolved substances. So in this instance, there's way more hydrogen inside the thylakoid than outside of the thylakoid. And so there is a higher concentration of hydrogen inside the thylakoid and a lower concentration of hydrogen outside in the stroma. Now we're going to talk about a protein or an enzyme called ATP synthase. The word synthesis means to make something. So synthase is an enzyme that makes something. We're going to utilize this enzyme and the hydrogen to make ATP. So here's how that works. Hydrogen cannot cross the phospholipid bilayer that makes up the wall of the thylakoid. So that means that hydrogen has to go through something to get out of the thylakoid. It has to go through, in this case, the ATP synthase protein. As hydrogen passes through that protein, it causes the protein to rotate, so it spins. And when it rotates, it causes ADP, which is, remember, adenosine diphosphate, to bind with a phosphate molecule. And when the ADP binds with the phosphate, it forms ATP. So now you have a molecule that has 3 phosphates attached to it and is more energetic than the ADP that we had before that only had 2 phosphates. So in here we can refer back to our diagram one more time to see what happens with the hydrogen. So remember, within the thylakoid space, you've got tons of hydrogen molecules, right? They're all here because that is where the water was when it was broken apart. That hydrogen is a higher concentration than it is out in the stroma. In the stroma, there's very little hydrogen, so we have a concentration gradient. Because of that concentration gradient, the osmotic pressure wants the hydrogen to go out of the thylakoid and into the stroma. And we can do that if it goes through the ATP synthase protein, since hydrogen ions cannot cross the phospholipid bilayer that makes up the membrane of the thylakoid. So the hydrogen travels through this ATP synthase protein, and as it does that, it takes ADP and it adds a phosphate ion, or a phosphate molecule, and it creates ATP, which is the energy molecule of the cell, and that energy can be used later to help make sugars. So to summarize, in the light reaction, photosystem 2 takes water molecules and splits them apart into hydrogen ions and oxygen gas. There's also 4 electrons that are produced, and they are sent to the electron transport chain and photosystem 1. The result of this is that we end up with hydrogen ions and NADPH, and the electrons binding together to form 2 NADPH molecules. That NADPH molecule behaves like a charged battery. It stores energy. That's going to be used later in the light-independent reaction, which we'll talk about in a future lecture. The other thing that happens during the light reaction is ATP formation. So we collected all those hydrogen ions from photosystem 2, and they pass through the ATP synthase enzyme and produce ATP molecules by taking an ADP molecule and a phosphate molecule and binding them together, so that we go from adenosine diphosphate with 2 phosphates, and we produce ATP, adenosine triphosphate, with 3 phosphates.